So today I'm going to be discussing the endocrine system, the main glands, and the main hormones. So first thing you guys need to remember is that this is known as the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is primarily composed of what we call ductless glands and these chemical messengers known as hormones. So your ductless glands are really important for you guys to understand their anatomical location, the aspects of the assessment, and essentially what hormones do those specific glands release. When it comes to the endocrine system, guys, the main part of the brain that regulates all hormonal activity, in essence, is going to be the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is very important because it communicates with the pituitary gland, whether it be the anterior or the adenohypophysis, or whether it's the posterior or the neurohypophysis. This is all correlated to the. This is all related to the negative feedback loop, and the negative feedback loop is essentially dictating that, or it's stating that the body does not always and consistently increase or decrease the hormone level so they can stay in their therapeutic value. They only release inhibiting or non-inhibiting hormones, meaning which allow the increase or decrease of a specific hormone when that value, that therapeutic value, goes out of whack, or when there's bodily demands that require for us to increase or decrease those specific hormones. And that, in a nutshell, is what your negative feedback loop is. So let's begin to discuss the glands that are the main gland, right? So we talk about the master gland, which is the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that actually controls, that dictates the pituitary gland hormone release. The hypothalamus doesn't get a title, so it's more like the shadow government, right? The shadow government. We don't know who they are, but they call the shots. Okay, the pituitary gland, that one gets the title, like the president. The master gland, it's very similar to the president. The president goes up, gives speeches, makes you feel warm and fuzzy. It appeals to your own bias, but he or she gets the title, right? But they're not really the ones that call the shots. It's the hypothalamus, the Illuminati, the shadow government that dictates the master gland, the president, the one that gets the title. That's the relationship, okay, folks? So I need you guys to understand which hormones are being released from each part of the pituitary gland. Let's discuss the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary gland. This one releases something called oxytocin. And oxytocin is important because it's responsible for something called the letdown reflex. And if you can imagine, a woman gives birth, right? And if the woman chooses to breastfeed, she will breastfeed her child. The baby's mouth will, let's see if I could draw this okay. Oh no, maybe I made it kind of creepy now, right? But you guys get the gist. The baby suckles on the nipple, and that stimulation causes the release of oxytocin. Now, if you understand birth and delivery, when a woman delivers the baby, her endometrium is bleeding because the placenta just attached itself from it. And so the goal is for oxytocin to contract that uterus. Well, when we dry up the baby, or we initially ensure the baby's airway, that it's patent, it's secure, we dry the baby up, then we want to encourage breastfeeding because that baby will suckle on the nipple, which will stimulate the release of oxytocin, which does two things. Oxytocin helps eject the milk, which helps the baby consume more milk, and it also contracts the uterus, which stops bleeding. And that's it's imperative for the mom's well-being. So this is why we have oxytocin, okay? It's also known as love hormone. We also have another hormone. This is known as antidiuretic hormone. And an antidiuretic hormone, you guys have to understand that it's a negative hormone. It creates a negative effect, meaning it decreases urinary output. And this is really important. A lot of students get confused with this. So what I want you guys to understand that whatever the urine output is, when we're discussing disorders with the ADH, whatever the urine output is, whether it's high or low, the ADH value in the blood will be the opposite. Okay, that's important for you guys to know. There's two conditions that we'll be discussing with ADH. It's syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone, which the patient develops oliguria. And since oliguria is low urine output, well, the ADH value is high because it's the opposite, right? And then we have another condition called diabetes insipidus. Now, diabetes insipidus has absolutely nothing to do with diabetes mellitus, nothing to do with blood sugar issues. However, let's use word association. The word diabetes should remind you of polyuria when it comes to urine output, because people who are diabetic with blood sugar issues, they develop polyuria as part of the 3 Ps, correct? Well, we're going to use that word to help us remember which urine output this particular patient is going to have when they have diabetes insipidus. Remember, diabetes insipidus has nothing to do with blood sugar issues, but the word diabetes reminds us of polyuria. High urine output, what's the ADH value? Low. In that regard, I want you guys to understand the relationship between ADH and urine output. Now, those are the only 2 hormones that we're going to be discussing for the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary gland. You guys are responsible for knowing these, okay? You guys are also responsible for knowing these other hormones that the adenohypophysis is releasing. So let's talk about these one at a time. The first one I want to discuss is thyroid stimulating hormone. This particular hormone doesn't do anything by itself, but this is a catalyst that allows the thyroid gland, which is located in the anterior neck. If you can imagine, this structure right here, that's the windpipe, that's the trachea, and anterior to it, you have the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is responsible for something called metabolism. And I want you guys to think of metabolism as your body's engine, okay? If it's working fast, if it's working low, you understand that when the engine is working hard, when it's elevated, when the metabolism is elevated, the engine runs hot. Activities speed up, okay? The juices get flowing. When you're talking about slow metabolism or low engine of low engine power, or low, what I was saying earlier, you understand that everything is relatively cool, everything's slowing down. So I want you guys to associate that idea with metabolism. Metabolism is high, everything's hot, everything's moving fast. Metabolism low, everything's slow. Now, the thyroid gland itself releases its own respective hormones, okay? You guys need to know them as T3, T4, and another hormone that does not influence metabolism, and that's calcitonin. Now, calcitonin, you should know because of the word, it has something to do with calcium, right? What's important to distinguish is whether this calcitonin increases or decreases calcium levels in the bloodstream. For those of us that speak Spanish, calcetines or calzones, these are underwear and socks. What do we do with underwear? With calzones, we pull them down, right? So keep in mind that calcitonin is the hormone that brings calcium levels down. And it's important for you guys to understand that when it decreases calcium levels, it decreases serum calcium, meaning the calcium in the blood is decreased. And keep in mind that we store all of our calcium, well, most of our calcium, in our bones. So the way that calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels is by pushing that calcium into the bone so the bones can utilize them to create more bone matrix. So these are the hormones that are responsible for, that are released by the thyroid gland. Keep in mind, folks, that the thyroid stimulating hormone is that inhibiting or not inhibiting hormone that's either going to tell the thyroid gland to either increase or decrease its production of T3 and T4 depending on what the body needs. For instance, if we're just waking up, our metabolism is relatively low. Even now during summer, you wake up and you go in your car and you turn the AC on, you're like, whoa, let me turn down a little bit because it's a little cold, because your body's engine is still a little bit low. And it takes a little bit for it to increase. So at that point, TSH is going to start increasing the production of T3 and T4 so your body can get with it. Okay, and it can start partaking in the daily activities that are needed for human beings, right? That's essentially how thyroid stimulating hormone works. I want you guys to keep that in mind. I want to focus a little bit on the assessment of the thyroid gland. You as a nurse, you want to stand behind the patient preferably, because if you're behind the patient, you can get their hands and lightly palpate the anterior surface of the thyroid gland. You could have them lift up their neck a little bit, extend, maybe swallow, if there are no known issues with the thyroid gland. But if the patient has thyroid issues like hyperthyroidism, you want to avoid the assessment. You don't want to be poking at it too hard because you may trigger thyroid storm, which we'll discuss later on in another video. All right, folks, so that's the main issue with thyroid gland, with TSH, T3, and T4. Let's talk about some other hormones that are being released by the anterior pituitary gland. We also have growth hormone. Now, keep in mind that growth hormone helps all your body tissues grow, okay? But I want to focus on a specific part of the body. I want to focus on the bones. Okay, the bones are really important because the bones have this part called the epiphysis, which is the distal ends of the bones. Okay, again, epiphysis. And then you have the shaft, or the middle part of the bone. That's known as the diaphysis. It's important for you guys to understand that the epiphyses, they have this specialized tissue or part of the segment of the bone that's responsible for growing, and they're at the epiphysis, and they're known as the epiphyseal plates, or the epiphyseal growth plates, and those are the parts of the bone that are receptive to growth hormone. So as we're growing, as we're children and we start growing, growth hormone gets triggered so it can be released as we're developing, as we're going through puberty, as we're going through different developmental stages of our lifehood, right? So it's the epiphyseal plate that responds to that particular growth. Keep in mind that those plates fuse, they close down, they close shop for business after the patient has reached maturity, after they're done with puberty. For men, it's like maybe their late teens, early 20s. For women, it's usually their late teens. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that these little areas, the epiphyseal plates, they're receptive to growth hormone. And this is going to allow the bones to grow linearly, right? Like this. The problem is we have two primary conditions that we'll be discussing with growth hormone. Well, three conditions. We have two conditions that are caused by an increased growth hormone, and that's what I really want to focus on right now. Keep in mind that if you have a growth hormone that's being released excessively, okay, while the patient is still growing, while the epiphyseal plates are still open for business, these kids develop gigantism when it's not treated well. They get really tall, 9 feet tall. Why is that? Because the epiphyseal plates are still open for business. They're receiving growth hormone. So these patients reach great heights, 9 feet tall. Almost my height, right? But when you have a patient who has an abnormal amount or an abundance of growth hormone being released after puberty, after adulthood is complete, well, they're not going to get so much big this way. Their hands and feet and other tissues are going to become more coarse and large. And that's called acromegaly. So the distinguishing factor between gigantism and acromegaly is essentially, when does growth hormone start being produced and in abundance? Does it before puberty is over, or is it after puberty is over? And that's what separates the difference between your gigantism and acromegaly. And of course, the decrease of growth hormone is going to be dwarfism, which we'll discuss that in more detail as well. And that's what I really want to focus on when it comes to growth hormone. Okay, folks? Let's talk about another one. We also have something called prolactin. Now, pro is in favor for. If you are pro-choice, pro-life, you're either pro in favor of either of those, correct? Well, when we have prolactin, pro means in favor of, lactin should remind you of lactation. So this is the hormone that triggers the mammary glands. Look at some of this stuff. The mammary glands, all here, they don't really look like this, but you guys get the gist. The little glands that produce milk, and it's the prolactin that's going to be released that stimulates the production of those mammary glands so they can start producing more milk. Let's talk about another one. Another hormone that comes from the adenohypophysis. We're talking about anterior pituitary gland, right? It's going to be your follicle stimulating hormone and something called your luteinizing hormone. Now, these two hormones are pretty important, more so for females because females have a monthly menstrual cycle that's categorized within 28 days, right? And so the follicle stimulating hormone, keep in mind that These are known as gonadotropic hormones, GTH, gonadotropic. We're talking about testes and ovaries. Those are the gonads, right? So when we talk about FSH, we're talking about the production or the beginning production of your ovum for the female or your sperm for the male, okay? And then we have luteinizing hormone. This one does the same thing, except within a different phase of the, let's say, Graafian follicle for the ovum or the spermatogenesis for men, for the creation of sperm. This is going to be helping with the maturation of those specific cell types, whether it be the ovum or the sperm. Now, this is more important, not more important, but you can really see how this plays out with the women's menstrual cycle, because the woman is done with her menses, the endometrium sheds off, right? Your estrogen and progesterone levels drop. At that point, you have your follicle stimulating hormone that not only triggers the creation of the ovum, but it correlates its function with female hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and it starts bringing them up as it's maintaining the integrity of the endometrium. As it maintains the integrity of the endometrium, it's also maintaining the integrity of the Graafian follicle. The ovaries are producing their eggs, right? And so FSH is a specific hormone that helps with the creation of the egg. Now, during ovulation, that's when luteinizing hormone comes in, and it starts peaking, and it releases the ovum into the fallopian tubes, hopefully for implantation and fertilization and implantation. Now, if your follicle stimulating hormone is doing its job, your estrogen progesterone levels are going to be high, the thickness of your endometrium is going to be intact, and implantation will be successful, assuming it gets fertilized. But do we get pregnant every time we have coitus? No. Do we get pregnant every time we have the menstrual cycle? No. So once it's no longer fertilized, FSH and LH drop and the endometrium sheds off, and that's how you have your menstrual cycle. In a nutshell, that's how it works. Now for men, the same thing happens, except we don't have a menstrual cycle, but we're consistently producing sperm. So this whole fluctuation of FSH and LH is consistent and daily for men, so we can really see it more so with the female ovulation cycle or the menstrual cycle, and that's why I was referring to that one instead of the sperm. So FSH, LH, those are the hormones that help us produce our ovum, our sperm, and it also helps our testicles produce testosterone, and our ovaries produce our female hormones, which are your estrogen and progesterones. So that's what needs to be known about both FSH and LH. And then we also have another one, ACTH. This is known as adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now look, I know all of these hormones are a little bit intimidating at times, but if you guys take your time and stand back a little bit and start breaking down the words, it should give you an idea as to which gland it's going to affect. Now, adrenal glands. This is a hormone, the tropic hormone, meaning the hormone that doesn't necessarily do something itself, but it does stimulate another target tissue, which is known as the adrenal glands, which are sitting on top of the kidneys. And I'm just going to draw the adrenal gland right here. Keep in mind that it has two segments. It has the cortex, and it has the medulla. Now, ACTH is only going to be influencing the cortex. The cortex produces something that we call stress hormones. Okay? And stress hormones are really important because they're supposed to be released whenever you have a particular activity that demands some degree of work, stress from the body. Okay? So make sure you guys write that down. Make sure you guys understand that the cortex releases stress hormones. Now, those particular stress hormones, we have two basic types. We have mineralocorticoids, and we have glucocorticoids. These are important. You have to know mineralocorticoids, and the main one is aldosterone. And glucocorticoids, the main one is cortisol. it's important for you guys to be able to associate the word minerals. We're talking about electrolytes, right? Minerals. The main one is going to be sodium. So aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid, influences sodium. It increases the sodium reabsorption at the kidney tubules, at the nephron tubules, because our body, when it absorbs salt into our systemic circulation, what follows? Fluid follows, so we maintain hydration. Stress hormone. Glucocorticoids, cortisol. Now the word glucose should remind you of sugar. This is a hormone that increases sugar levels in our bloodstream. It increases blood sugar levels. Now, I emphasize the idea that these hormones are stress hormones, right? Well, I have a little illustration that I can use to help you associate the need for these hormones and how it plays a vital role in the maintenance of homeostasis. If we have Federico right here, okay, and Federico has to climb up this hill so it can get its water. Whoops, it's not working. Let's actually do it right here. So let's say that we have Federico that has to climb up this hill, and this is where he's going to find water, and this is also where he is going to find apples, okay? Because he'll be able to eat them, and maybe there's a little chicken here. I don't know how to draw chickens, but you guys get the gist. Federico has to climb up that hill so he can drink and so he can nourish himself, so he can eat. But there's always a problem whenever we become physically active. We have the sun right here, and it's hot, okay? Climate change is real, hot. So when we're talking about stress hormones, folks, I want you guys to get to the idea that anytime your body gets presented with an idea of the body being placed under stressful situations, well, in this case, the example is Federico is walking up that hill. If it's hot, what do you do when your body gets hot? It sweats, you're losing fluids, you're losing, what does sweat taste like? Salty, right? So we're losing sodium, we're losing fluids, we're losing electrolytes. At the same time, when your cells become active and they carry out any type of activity, they're utilizing glucose. So it's fair to say that when you become stressed out, your body needs fluids to maintain hydration, and they need glucose to maintain cell function. Well, at that point, your stress is increasing. Your pituitary gland knows it because the hypothalamus told it that right now we're undergoing a particular event that requires stress hormones. So ACTH is released, it sends it to the adrenal cortex, and the adrenal cortex releases its two hormones, aldosterone and cortisol. And at that point, Federico here starts retaining sodium, hence fluid starts being retained, and you maintain hydration. So Federico starts making his way up. Maybe not like that. Okay, so my point is he starts making its way up. Now, how is Federico able to maintain this physical demand, this stressful demand? Well, he's got aldosterone and cortisol being released, which provides sugar for cell function so he can have clarity and so his muscles can work how they need to so they can work up their way up there. And aldosterone is also being released so the patient can stay hydrated and cellular activity can be functioning adequately. And at that point, the patient can drink water and eat its food, and that's how stress hormones are effective. Keep in mind that we're not discussing, for the sense of ATI or NCLEX, we're not discussing issues that deal with Federico running up a hill. We're talking about post-op patients. When you're post-op, your body's healing. You need stress hormones. If a patient has a condition where they don't have enough of those hormones, there's a problem because they cannot withstand stress. And the biggest issue when you can't withstand stress is that you can't keep fluids in your body and you develop hypotension and potential shock. If the patient suffered the loss of a loved one, they're crying, they're in bereavement, correct? That's stress. So anytime any type of activity or any type of psychological demand is placed on the patient, that demand stress, we need these hormones, folks, and that's why this is important, okay? We also have the medulla. Now, the medulla is a little bit different because this one releases something called catecholamines, and that you do have to know. And catecholamines are essentially your fight or flight hormones, your epinephrine and your norepinephrine. Okay? And a lot of students ask, well, what's the difference between epinephrine and norepinephrine? Well, think of epinephrine as Coke. Think of norepinephrine as Shasta. Okay? So the same thing, just a little bit different. But those are your catecholamines. They are responsible for your fight or flight mechanism. And you'll be discussing conditions like pheochromocytoma, which is a tumor mass inside the medulla. But we'll discuss that later on. Moving forward. Okay. We also have a melanocyte stimulating hormone, but I'm going to speak less of that one. It just controls a pigment that your skin is going to be producing throughout its lifetime. And those are essentially, folks, the main hormones that are being released by the pituitary gland. But we have a couple more that we haven't discussed. So let me clear some of these things out. I want to emphasize a little bit the idea of bone mineralization, right? So we have two basic types of bone cells, of osteocytes, right? We have your bone forming, known as osteoblasts, and B for building, they form new bone matrix. And then you have the ones that do the opposite, that break it down. I don't like to use the word break it down because it's got the word B in it, but I do like the word osteoclast. And C for catastrophe. What happens in catastrophes? What happened in Mexico 2 nights ago? A big earthquake, right? Things get taken down, they fall apart. So that's your osteoclast. Osteoclast releases calcium into the bloodstream as it's breaking down the bone matrix. And osteoblast builds the bone by bringing in that calcium and utilizing it to build more bone matrix. Now, there's 2 hormones that help out with this function. We've discussed one of them already. We've discussed calcitonin. Now remember, calcitonin, calcitines, we take them down. So calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels. And what this hormone does is it influences the respective osteocyte so it can bring in that calcium and so it can start creating more bone matrix to make the bones more ossified, to make them more dense, to keep them healthy. That's what calcitonin does, folks. I need you guys to understand that calcitonin reduces blood serum calcium levels and it pushes it inside the bone. Now, when it's healthy and when it's all therapeutic, it doesn't overdo it. It does it just right to keep the serum calcium within 8.5 and 10.8. Okay? As long as it's within this level, we have enough calcium in our bloodstream to maintain osteocyte function and to also maintain muscular conductivity. That's very important, folks, because if we have hypocalcemia, which can happen in this condition when you have too much of this, let's say, right? Then you can develop tetany, which is muscular excitability, which can cause laryngeal spasms, close up your airway, and you die, which we've discussed actually in prior videos. But my point is that calcitonin decreases calcium levels by depositing that calcium inside the bone so it can create more bone matrix. Then we have another gland. Now, another hormone. Now, this hormone is known as parathormone or parathyroid hormone. And this is located behind the thyroid gland, okay? So if you can imagine, you have your trachea right here, a little bootleg trachea, and you have the posterior end posterior of the thyroid gland. And this is where you have these little nodes right here are known as the parathyroid glands. Now, these glands release parathyroid hormone or parathormone to combine the two. And when this particular hormone is released, what that does is it stimulates the respective osteocyte to break down some of that calcium and release it out into the bloodstream. And so parathyroid hormone or parathormone increases serum calcium levels, and that's important for you guys to understand. I want you guys to be able to have a solid foundation. When you guys have a solid foundation, it doesn't matter what they ask you later on. When you get to the disorders, it becomes a lot more feasible and more attainable. So, if you have parathyroid hormone, right, or if you have if you have an excessive amount of parathyroid hormone. Now, what does parathyroid hormone do? It increases calcium levels. Well, what if you have hyperparathyroidism? Hyper is excessive. Parathyroid, we're talking about these nodes behind the thyroid gland, and you know that this hormone increases calcium levels. So when somebody has hyperparathyroidism, they're going to have an excessive amount of calcium in the bloodstream. Now, where did we get that calcium from? We got it from the bone. So what happens to the bone integrity? They demineralize. The patient will develop pathological fractures. You guys see where I'm going with this? On top of that, now that we have hyperparathyroidism in my scenario, we have an excessive and abundant amount of calcium in the bloodstream, meaning greater than 10.8. Let's say it's 15. When that happens, now we have a bunch of calcium in the bloodstream. What's going to happen to that calcium as it starts making its way through all the organs that blood takes calcium through, including the kidneys? You're going to develop urolithiasis, calcium stones, okay? Or kidney stones, excuse me. So that's the context in which I want you guys to understand this basic anatomy and physiology and function of all the endocrine glands and the respective hormones. We have one more gland to discuss. Now we have a cool little gland that we discussed in the GI system video, but this is known as a pancreas. Okay, and the pancreas is really cool because it plays both sides of the field. It has an endocrine function and an exocrine function. The exocrine function deals more with digestion, but the endocrine function deals with, of course, hormones. And so within the actual pancreas, you have something called the islets of Langerhans. Okay, and these particular cluster of cells, they're kind of like this in a way, and then you have some other cells inside like this, and those are the cells that actually produce the hormones that I'm going to be discussing that deal with the pancreas. Okay, so we're talking about alpha and we're talking about beta cells. Keep in mind that your alpha cells release glucagon, and your beta cells release insulin. Okay, these are very important hormones. These hormones help regulate blood sugar levels in the blood and blood sugar levels. And keep in mind that your blood sugar level should be anywhere from 70 to 110. That's your fasting glucose level, right? But generally speaking, when we're talking about diabetes and just patients with blood sugar fluctuations in general, as long as the blood sugar is below 140, you're not necessarily going to have any issues. Hell, we can actually move that less than 150. Now, we're talking about theoretical concepts, guys. We're talking about what the book says. We're talking about what peer-reviewed data, empirical data suggests. However, everybody's different, so don't apply this to your mom or Theo, because they might be a little messed up with their blood sugar consistently being 150. Moving forward. The reason why blood sugars, generally speaking, less than 150 are okay is because the blood sugar is not high enough for the glucose to actually do any particular damage. This is why most sliding scales, when you guys go to your facilities and you look through the sliding scale of the patient, their blood sugar, their insulin values, or the amount of insulin that you're supposed to give doesn't start until it's about 150. Okay? Now, moving back to the hormones, all right? Your alpha cells release glucagon. Now, glucagon does something really cool. If we have the liver here, okay, we normally store our excess sugars as something called glycogen. And whenever we become physically active and our blood sugar drops and we don't have anything to eat, or when we are sleeping and our blood sugar drops because we don't have anything to eat, or when we're doing anything that our blood sugar drops because we don't have anything to eat, well, the glucagon hormone is now released and it converts glycogen into glucose. And now glucose can actively be absorbed by your cells, and that's where insulin comes in, because it gets your sugar that you have in your bloodstream and it pushes it inside of the cells. Okay, I want you guys to understand that basic concept. That glucagon, let me write it down here real quick. So again, glucagon increases blood sugar levels. And I showed you guys how. Glucagon converts stored sugar in the liver, glycogen, into active functioning glucose that can be utilized. And then that's how it increases blood sugar levels, right? But then your insulin is released when your blood sugar levels are a little bit too high, and it can decrease blood sugar levels by getting that sugar, lassoing it, being the key that opens up the cell, and it pushes the sugar inside the cell, and now it effectively reduces blood sugar levels. And this is how your insulin and glucagon behave. It is important that our pancreas remains healthy, that we do not overstimulate it by consuming too much high fructose corn syrup, let's say, or by consuming other foods that are potentially bad for the pancreas, such as alcohol. And that way we can maintain normal glucose levels. Okay, folks, I believe that summarizes. Oh, we also have thymosin that's released from the thymus. It primarily deals with immunity, and the gland itself atrophies after puberty, and it plays a lesser role in immunity, but it plays a more important vital role when we're children. The thymus releases thymosin. I'll write it up here real quick. The thymus releases thymosin. Okay, and that deals with immunity. Okay, so I believe that kind of summarizes what I wanted to get at. I hope this kind of makes sense, folks. Please follow me on Learn NCLEX now, and I'll see you guys in the next one.